Retrofuture.
Good day, ladies and gentlemen. And first of all, a happy new year. We have a lot of plans for 2023, starting with our upcoming Kickstarter, which you can follow by clicking the link below. As for this video, we'll be discussing Cyberpunk. No, not the game, but the genre and associated aesthetics. Today, I want to discuss the aesthetic of Cyberpunk and how it developed. Aesthetically, Cyberpunk was a major thing in the 90s, becoming a very prevalent aesthetic in music videos and small-scale productions that, unlike the sterile sets or typical science fiction, was a DIY aesthetic that could be made on the cheap. It was used in game shows, MTV, and television shows like Mystery Science Theater 3000 and Max Headroom. There were some very influential games and movies in the genre like System Shock, Blade Runner, Freejack, Ghost in the Shell, and Akira. But what is Cyberpunk? For those that don't know, Cyberpunk is a subgenre of science fiction, but rather than humans exploring the stars, the stories speculate about societies in the near future with a rather dystopian edge. Humans would discover all kinds of technological innovations, but instead of using this to improve humans' condition, it made it worse. Why would you write something like that? Well, for starters, Cyberpunk was born in the 80s, a decade of notorious commercialism and the final years of the Cold War. The fallout of the Vietnam War, government overreach, and corporate interest inspired a very sour outlook on the future, in particular one that would get started with the press of a button. This inspired punk, a musical genre that drew its inspiration from various sources, such as rock and roll, metal, but also ska and blues. What made punk that controversial was the tendency of the musicians to shout profanities, sing scandalous lyrics, and literally piss on the audience. Something that prevalent middle-class morality did not approve of. But what does that have to do with Cyberpunk? Cyberpunk is a subgenre of science fiction that takes the reader 5 minutes into the future. William Gibson is often considered to be the one who laid the foundations for the genre with his book Neuromancer, but in my opinion, Philip K. Dick is the real powerhouse behind Cyberpunk, especially his novel Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep that inspired Blade Runner a decade before the highly overrated Neuromancer was even conceived. What I want to focus on today, however, is the aesthetic associated with it. But first, what is Cyberpunk about? In many of these speculative settings of Cyberpunk, individualism is taken to an extreme where heavy body modification is sold as self-expression and one of life's many necessities. Society is no longer a community, but a ladder for the ambitious to climb. To elaborate, dystopian fiction has been around since the 1900s, but what made Cyberpunk different in its aesthetic was that it was very 80s. From neon lighting down to the mohawks and the aggressive advertising encouraging the masses to consume. Meanwhile, the government has simply given up on regulating the mega corporations, if they're not outright working for them. Or as Carl von Clausewitz had said, war is nothing but business with a mixture of other means. Another thing, in particular our younger viewers need to understand that is in the 90s, hacking and computer technology was a magical thing that few people understood. Wireless computer technology was purely conceptual, and don't get me started on modems, VGA monitors and floppy disks. Standardization was almost non-existent, making computing a hard hobby to get into. Early electric computers looked like jerry-rigged monstrosities that required massive attachments just to give your rig that few more kilobytes of memory. And that is what the computers in Cyberpunk looked like. Machines the size of service elevators whose cables were cluttering rooms that were dimly lit by the light of monitor screens. Blade Runner finalized this aesthetic by making cities look like abandoned basements, littered with all manner of items that people had just forgotten about. Inside these fictional settings, even buildings would be arranged according to strewn about household items, like kitchen sinks, or the front of the Millennium Falcon. Over the decades, science fiction shows updated their visuals to the expectations of modern innovation. The massive machines in Star Trek didn't make much sense by the time the 90s came around, so this got updated in the next generation. Overall, the bulky designs of the 1950s got replaced with streamlined and purely functional designs. Television screens became paper-thin displays or even holographic. Typewriters became touchscreens, and so on. But now, look at the latest, biggest addition to the cyberpunk genre, Cyberpunk 2077 by CG Projekt Red. It all looks so mundane, yeah, it looks a bit dystopian. If not like the West will be in 10 years from now, with sleek screens, holograms, and miniaturized technology. It all looks so mundane and indistinguishable from other science fiction. Not all cyberpunk games are like this. Many indie developers have embraced the 8-bit and neo-noir aesthetic, and then, of course, there are cyberpunk edge runners. As stated before, the cyberpunk genre was a product of its time. Violent riots in the streets, corporate greed is running amok, unbridled globalism and conflicts in Africa and America intensified by the Cold War gave rise to a new form of nihilism, that nothing mattered and there was no heaven to look forward to. It was a new world in which only material needs mattered and religion was replaced by a blind belief in progress. It didn't matter what kind of progress, as long as things were changing, be it technological or otherwise. That nihilism inspired cyberpunk. Technology flourished while the state of humanity stagnated. A future determined by corporate interest and the consuming public's desires. People started investing in body modification, not because it made them happier, but in order to consume what was on offer. It was the logical outcome of unbridled consumerism. The human body was just another dispensable commodity that required upgrades to keep up with the trends in innovations and fashion, inflamed by the needs to compete, especially by the states themselves, who need to field the most advanced cyborgs to remain relevant on the global stage. This is especially visible in animes like Ghost in the Shell and Psycho Pass. These worlds are changing that fast. Today's hot new thing is tomorrow's garbage left on the sidewalk to be forgotten. And don't think anyone comes by to collect. The streets are literal basements filled with obsolete technology, and so are its people. Veterans walking around with malfunctioning prosthetics, people whose bodies rejected their implants, and of course, those who could never afford the most basic of augmentations to begin with, disqualifying them from public life. If with no gods to believe in, what do? What is helping you get up in the morning? Drugs and escapism are in high demand, and corporations and criminals are eager suppliers. And each experience needs to be different and more extreme than the last. The purveyors of such technology are, of course, the corporate salarymen and government clerks who have the expendable income to afford all this nonsense, and like everyone else, they need to upgrade their hardware, be these computer rigs or implants, to keep consuming the newest and hottest types of entertainment. That is how these salarymen and their employers keep the system going, by producing and consuming. The people at the bottom, however, can barely participate in this technology. They need to do more with less. Instead, they use pirated software, knockoff products, and hand-me-down technology to build their machines and prosthetics, leading to a DIY punk aesthetic cyberpunk is known for today. Now there are exceptions at the bottom, those who are willing to do the odd and clandestine jobs the higher ups need doing. Gangs are useful mercenaries because they will do anything for money, and more importantly, they always seek an edge over their rivals by acquiring better weapons, implants, drugs, or particular favors. But we'll save that topic for our next Cyberpunk video. I'll say this. Like the street gangs of today, these gangs all have their own aesthetic, like tattoos, hairstyles, clothing, and body modification. These razor gangs with their spiked jackets and mohawks for the longest time dominated the cyberpunk landscape, because that is what the anarchists in the 1980s looked like. Punk in Germany is still a dirty word because of the violence that was associated with both the music and the domestic terrorists like the Roten Army Fraktion and far-right elements. Or so I'm told. And that is how I prefer my cyberpunk. The mohawks and spiked jackets, the wires and tube televisions, the trippy visuals and outdated perceptions of the future. Cyberpunk is kinda like steampunk in a way, the aesthetic that is based on an obsolete vision of the future, just like the 19th century science fiction. Cyberpunk has become retrofuturistic, or it could have been. Looking at I digress. The point is, the mid-20-somethings today do not recall the Wild West that the computer industry used to be like, or how gaming culture has changed by the advent of multiplayer games on the internet. Introvert boys became friends because they could visit each other's homes to play on their video game systems, and meet each other's parents because, well, that was the only way to play together. Imagine that! Let's not even get started on social media. And it's a shame, because the grimy DIY look at the time was everywhere. Mad Max, MTV, Max Headroom, Mystery Science Theater 3000, damn, a lot of Maxes. And such of the 90s budget sci-fi had this dirt, hot-glued aesthetic that is unthinkable now. When people attempt to recreate the magic of that age, they do so without knowing why, as I explained in my previous video where I discussed Blade Runner and The Prisoner. I already went on a rant before on how CGI has ruined science fiction. When we talk about the development of movies and genre writing, we often think about authors and producers. We give too little credit to the people who build the miniatures and sets of things like Blade Runner and other sci-fi films. CGI has its place. It allows for a lot cheaper production costs. You don't need to hire studios to build elaborate sets or miniature cities on. It's all very understandable. But it are those crappy model cities that make Blade Runner as famous as it is today. Cameramen and editors needed to improvise on how to film such sets. Now directors have full control over the camera, which ironically stifles creativity. Some of cinema's greatest moments came about through adversity, and it is why many modern movies look so sterile and choreographed. So much of it is post-production now. Actors, cameramen, editors, they don't meet each other in the sets anymore, so they do not capture the energy that the actors and the cameramen used to have in the past. Now artists sit in front of computer screens, looking at some actors walking in front of a green screen, and get an assignment like put this statue over here and put a waterfall over there. And the artists just shrug because they do not know these actors or understand the creative context in which these images were conceived. And the same goes for the actors, completely separated from their environment because they're in these green rooms with no idea what the environment they are in will look like. At least that is my interpretation of it. Will we ever see a return to the retrofuturism of cyberpunk? Well, only time will tell. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, I'm gonna bid you adieu. Please follow our upcoming Kickstarter, Bound for the Sticks, which will include me, Dankert Lexicon, as the founder. learn about my home city of arcology and its role in the ever-expanding multiverse of the Association of Ishtar. We seek more writers to help us expand this universe. We're also looking into using World Anvil to record the many adventures and operations of the Association of Ishtar and their discoveries. If you want to get involved, please join our Discord, whose link is down below. We're looking forward to meeting you there, and of course, make things your way.